Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The Malaysian government last month deported 1,086 people it claimed were illegal immigrants on 3 Myanmar Navy ships. Now, it did so just hours after an interim court order banning the group's removal, pending a legal bid by Amnesty International and Asylum Access to halt the plan. Yesterday, the High Court granted the international human rights groups permission to challenge the recent deportation of Myanmar nationals. Let's hear from one of those human rights groups. We have Tham, Ying, who is the Executive Director of Asylum Access Malaysia. Ying, welcome back to the show. It's good to have you on again. So did this High Court ruling or High Court decision come as a surprise? Were you expecting it to rule or to decide in your favor, allowing for this legal challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think it came as a very huge surprise for us. I mean, of course, we were elated, by the decision. I think that, for those who, NGOs who have tried bringing actions into court, most of the time we've seen sort of really massive obstacles in our way. And so we weren't expecting this to be any different. But yeah, against all odds, we were granted the leave. And so, yes, we were extremely ecstatic. Yeah.
Right, just to help us understand the process now, Ying, it's in the legal jargon, leave to challenge, right? So it's you're only really at the starting point. Could you explain to us what's ahead in terms of this challenge?
Sure. So maybe just to sort of, and I probably can't do this very well. My lawyers probably do it better. But basically, we're just, we've just obtained permission to challenge the deportation order, right? And what that means is, and the implication of this sort of being granted this leave is sort of twofold. So firstly, in the judgment, the court sort of affirmed the role of NGOs and civil society organizations in challenging government decisions in court on matters of public interest, and so basically what we're seeing is that the government cannot just dismiss judicial review applications by NGOs simply as being trivial or misconceived, and in so the court has acknowledged basically the role of NGOs in today's society in helping ensure accountability and transparency. The other point is around sort of jurisdiction. So, the High Court sort of rejected this assertion that, an ouster clause in, the Immigration Act meant that leave, could not be granted to proceed with a judicial review of the deportation. Basically, what that signals is that, an ouster clause should not be used as, a carte blanche to dismiss attempts at, judicial reviews as being, either frivolous or vexatious.
Right. So just to follow up on that, I read somewhere that, Malaysian law somehow bar immigration decisions from being questioned in court. Am I interpreting that correctly?
So basically with the Immigration Act, there's a particular clause, or rather section 59A, that seemingly suggests that decisions by the DG of Immigration and the Minister of Home Affairs cannot be subjected to judicial review. And this has been cited repeatedly to prevent the court's scrutiny of immigration decisions. But of course, the court yesterday sort of departed from that sort of narrow interpretation of that clause, and has instead said that there is a case for us to sort of proceed for judicial review.
Right, Ying. I mean, one of the things that I guess us non-lawyers like to talk about is the apparent contradictions in the way the law works, right? So some people are held in contempt of court when they go against a court ruling, or they are critical of it. And so this is an instance where we saw the court rule in regard to the deportation, and yet the government went ahead with it. How do we understand that? I mean, can the Immigration Department be held in contempt for going ahead despite the stay of execution that the courts gave?
Yeah, so that's something that we're still exploring, and we haven't really made a decision yet in terms of the sort of contempt proceedings. But of course, I mean, it raises the questions that you mentioned, right, Sharaad? Like, I mean, this sort of like accountability, right? The fact that there was this sort of order, and they nevertheless went ahead with the deportation. I think it warrants us sort of having answers. Like we should be demanding for answers, right? I think. Not just to us, but like I think the public deserves to know why the government has done that, seemingly in our name, right?
Right. So, Ying, can I ask you now that we have this ruling, but yet we still have over 1,000 Myanmar nationals have already been deported. What happens now? What are the implications for those 1,000 Myanmar nationals that have already been deported? And I believe 114 other Myanmar nationals are still in Malaysia?
Yeah, so even in terms of the numbers, so we do know that 1,086 have been deported. We don't actually know the exact numbers of those who have remained. We're just making a deduction of 114 based on the sort of 1,002 figure that was given to us early on. But the number may be higher. We're not too sure. But in terms of the 1,086 people who have returned, unfortunately, I mean, I think all of us are really aware about the escalating sort of situation in Myanmar, and we are rightly concerned about their safety, which was sort of the motivation behind us filing this application in the first place, was that we were concerned that they would be sent back to a dangerous situation. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to gather more information about their status or their situation. All we know is that they are already in Myanmar, and we can only sort of imagine what the situation is like, based on the reports we're reading about the rapidly deteriorating situation. In terms of the 114 or so, maybe more, we don't know as well what the status is. We do not have the details about these people. We don't know where they are. We don't know what they are like. We don't know their identities. We don't know if there are like refugees or asylum seekers among them. So yeah, it is quite concerning that we don't have any sort of information regarding these people. But that being said, though, yesterday in granting us the leave, the court did extend the stay for the 114 people who have remained, and that and the court has said that the stay means they should not be deported until the judicial review is disposed of.
Right. Yeah, so that's very interesting because again, we are at the situation to see whether the government actually, or the immigration department more specifically, defies the court by going ahead and deporting these remaining, refugees or immigrants or whatever their status might be. I do want to ask you though, the wheels of justice turn very slowly, not just in Malaysia, but around the world. What do you expect is the timeline for this whole process?
It will probably take a few months, just to sort of, I mean, I don't really have an estimate, but what I've been told is it'll probably likely take a few months for the judicial hearing to proceed. Yeah, so in the meantime, it really is sort of hoping that the government will sort of come forward and provide us with more information about the 1,200 people.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is a lot of lack of information, right? So you're not sure exactly how many people or what's going to happen. Lack of clarity coming from the immigration department. What are you hoping the immigration department do next? I mean, what kind of next steps would you like to see the immigration department do, particularly as the public watching this? Again, I mean, if you are working on the ground with very little information, you can imagine the public also has very little clarity as to what is happening at the moment. We're just caught off guard with all these headlines. What are you hoping will happen next?
Yeah, I think as an immediate step, I think would be to grant UNHCR access to immigration detention centers. So UNHCR has not had access since August 2019. So for over a year and a half, we're talking about people not being able to, people seeking asylum, not having an opportunity for their claims to be assessed. I do think that there needs to be a lot more like openness, so more transparency around people who they're deporting. I think especially since, we have sort of, the information that we've received is that there are sort of refugees and asylum seekers, children who are separated from like either or both parents, or like, women who are separated from their spouses. So it's all just very concerning. And I think that like they need to sort of be a little bit, more aware about, having some sort of like screening mechanism where, vulnerable people, people who should not be sent back are not sort of like deported. I think it's just sort of very important, to note that like we do have international obligations, right? And that is the sort of motivation behind us filing this application, is that, we want to stop the government from violating fundamental obligations that they have signed on to, right? Non-reform on whether it's the Child Act or, the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination of Women. We really do need to ensure that deportations that violate the principle, these sort of basic human rights principles must never occur again.
Ying, thank you so much for joining us on the show, and thank you for the good work that you're doing. All the best with the judicial review. We're going to take a quick break here on the show, and we will be back with more on this topic, so stay tuned.
Mampukah rangkaian anda memperkasa organ?
Memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face mask, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Perang COVID-19 tetap belum berakhir. Pastikan setiap langkah berjaga-jaga diamalkan, dari kebersihan tangan, pemakaian pelitup muka, penjarakan fizikal. Kesemuanya amat penting untuk pastikan pandemik ini dibendung.
Fokus kita sekarang adalah gelombang ketiga. Elakkan 3S, iaitu kawasan yang sesak, sempit dan juga bersembang pada jarak yang dekat. Berdisiplinlah kerana virus ini tidak mengira darjat, umur mahupun latar belakang anda. Tiada masa untuk kita berlengah lagi.
Kita sekarang telah memasuki gelombang ketiga COVID-19. Setiap langkah pencegahan perlu diamalkan dengan penuh tanggungjawab dan disiplin. Kita mampu meratakan lengkung pandemik ini. Semuanya di tangan kita bersama.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face mask, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Perang COVID-19 tetap belum berakhir. Pastikan setiap langkah berjaga-jaga diamalkan, dari kebersihan tangan, pemakaian pelitup muka, penjarakan fizikal.
Thank you so much for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Let's continue our conversation about the High Court's decision yesterday to allow a challenge brought by two human rights groups against the government plan to deport 1,200 Myanmar nationals back to the country last month. Joining us now, we have Lilianne. She's the co-founder and international director of Yutaniod Foundation and chair of the Rohingya Working Network. Rohingya Working Group at the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. Lilianne, welcome to the show. It's good to have you here. Thanks for joining us. Can I get you to start by sharing with us what you think are the implications of the High Court decision that just came recently?
I think what's really important about this decision is the recognition that there are people who are in the detention centers right now who are actually vulnerable, and vulnerable in terms of needing international protection. And this would really be the group of persons who have asylum claims or have already been registered with UNHCR. And I think that it is quite complicated because UNHCR used to have access to detention centers, but actually has lost that access since August 2019. And I think what's really important about this decision is the recognition by the judicial system that, in fact, this claim of the human rights NGOs that there are people who are in these groups of undocumented migrants who, in fact, have additional vulnerabilities, and particularly vulnerabilities which would put them in danger, in potential danger or potential risk, to their lives or to their security, would they be returned. And that's, under international law, whether a country has or hasn't signed the Refugee Convention, all countries are bound by this this principle of non-refoulement, which means you are not supposed to return somebody who could face persecution or risk in their country of origin. So I think what's really important in this is the fact that there's a recognition by, one of our national courts at the High Court level, and it could set a precedent, I think. And I think what's important is, what's the response of the government going to be in response to this decision? I think that, of course, there's been, different claims, and it's been a bit confrontational. But I think what's important in this is how do we make the process of verification of those vulnerable groups effective? I think the immigration does understand that there are persons who have registration with UNHCR. One of the issues is that many times when people are arrested, they actually don't have those documents on them. And there's also the question about the UNHCR letter. Many people who have UNHCR letters are sometimes not always recognized by the immigration. So I think there's a whole host of issues that should really be discussed, even at a very technical level, by the immigration, with UNHCR, with the other relevant ministries, about how do we make this verification process of persons with those protection concerns much more effective and transparent, so that we don't end up in a situation, again, where a deportation is going to lead to potentially putting persons who would be at risk in a situation where they're being returned.
Lilianne, to do one very quick question. In terms of access to detention centers, don't organizations like the ICRC still have access, and they do some of the work that the UNHCR is not available to them? And also, just looking back to even to the 90s, when we had that Achinese refugee situation, we remember the clashes that happened in the Semenyih camp and the deportations. And we've had a long history of deporting people in vulnerable people in danger. So, do you think it's also about a kind of culture within our governments and bureaucracies?
Sorry. Just to add on to one thing, Lilianne, you mentioned that UNHCR lost access to the deportation sentence since August 2019. Is that correct?
That's right.
Do you know why, and why they no longer have access to the refugees?
I think to answer Melissa's question first, I'm not sure an official reason was actually given, but it's always a negotiation process between HCR and the immigration to get that access. HCR is still functioning here on the goodwill of the government. So essentially, government decisions, the government has the sovereignty to make those decisions about whether it grants access or not. I think that there have been certain issues, which have probably been discussed with UNHCR about immigration concerns about the process, and probably it has to do with, perhaps the fear that when UNHCR enters an immigration detention center, that they might just end up registering a lot of people. And so I think that could be one of the concerns of the immigration. But I do think that, I have to say, to be fair, since the days of the Aceh deportations, for example, and, the refoulement of Achinese on TNI ships, I think that we actually have come a long way. So, this isn't really a kind of standard operating procedure to, send back persons with specific, refugee claims or asylum concerns. I think that in this case, there has been, from the immigration's point of view, it's a regular deportation, right? I think from as far as the immigration is concerned, there haven't been persons with protection needs on that list. So I don't think the immigration is intentionally sending back persons with UNHCR documentation. And in fact, they had said themselves, certainly one thing is they're not sending Rohingya back. And partly that's because the Myanmar embassy doesn't recognize Rohingya anyway. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that documentation wasn't clear. So I think there are issues which are more technical rather than political. And if I understand correctly, there in fact were parts of the government who were trying to request for at least a postponement of this particular deportation, precisely because of the situation in Myanmar and, of course, ASEAN's attempt to engage with that situation and try to see if there's a way to de-escalate the tensions and the political tensions that are taking place in Myanmar right now. So I think a lot of it is, I'm not sure everyone would agree with me, but I do think that it's more of a technical issue as well. And I think that there are alternatives, right? I think if the immigration is not yet ready to allow UNHCR access, there are other ways of letting other parties access. So Sharaad, you brought up ICRC, for example. ICRC doesn't have a mandate for status determination of refugees and asylum seekers. That really is HCR's mandate. But, Suharkam, for example, Suharkam, the National Human Rights Commission, can also request access, should be granted access, and they have been in the past. And there could be a way that they could be that bridging mechanism, right, to try to help with that verification process.
Could you help us understand, for many Malaysians perhaps don't fully empathize with the situation of those who've been sent back. What exactly do they encounter when they return?
So I think the situation in Myanmar has shifted dramatically, and I think we need to understand that there's a level of risk currently for all civilians in Myanmar. The conditions currently in Myanmar are really deteriorating rapidly to the point that persons who are, number one, involved in the demonstrations against the military who took over power are very much at risk. There are sieges of even public facilities such as hospitals that are taking place. So even persons who aren't involved in the demonstrations themselves but who are sick are also getting affected by this. There have been people who've just been standing by on the streets and not directly protesting who've been already injured as well. There's a lot of fear at the moment by the civilian, from the part of the civilian population because of the security forces' increasingly harsh response and increasing use of violence against civilians. And then, of course, you have the added risks of persons who are from minorities who have already been persecuted for a very long time. And I think we need to understand that the military that's taken over power is the same military that has actually been perpetrating an incredibly wide range of human rights abuses with impunity against ethnic minorities for a really long time. So I think it's really about understanding the different levels of risk. There's a risk for the entire group to be sent back, but I think a lot of that as well, not all of those people who are on the boat have asylum claims here in Malaysia or even have documentation. So I think there's two levels. One is the protection needs of people who have a level of documentation or have tried to claim asylum. And number two, really verifying that before any deportation takes place, that it is absolutely voluntary for everyone. And the immigration has said that they had done that they actually did try to ensure that everyone was being given that, that choice. But I think that, again, those types of claims really need a third party, which is independent, such as Suharkam, to be able to verify that, in fact, even voluntariness is really something which, we can confirm, and there hasn't been coercion involved.
Sorry, just to clarify, you're saying that the refugees are given the choice of deportation, whether they want to go back. Is that right?
That's what should happen. So it should be, there should be a consent form that is signed. But I think one of the concerns is that there have been reports, that there have been incidents of coercion, and that some people are not actually given that choice and not really told very clearly that they're going to be, deported even. So we've heard a lot of reports from relatives, for example. So I think that, having some type of independent party that can oversee and monitor and verify that all of these processes that are being put in place are actually being done, properly and effectively. I think that's just really critical.
Right. So Lilianne, I wanted to ask you about whether, because you mentioned again that the military coup is being led by the Myanmar general responsible for a whole host of genocidal policies, particularly the one that we've seen in Rakhine State. I'm wondering whether you think this military coup could lead to another refugee crisis. I saw that Thailand has started preparing facilities in provinces that border Myanmar to perhaps accommodate what they are expecting to be an influx of more refugees from this latest military coup. Is that something that you see happening for the rest of the region as well?
It definitely is. It definitely is. I think Thailand is very wise to start making those preparations. I think we are going to see an increase of refugee flows, and I think it's not only going to be from the areas where we've traditionally seen refugees fleeing from. It's not only going to be Rakhine or Kachin or Karen State. It's going to be other areas as well, and I think that you're going to start seeing, once movement actually becomes possible. But of course, you already have active smuggling routes, which are very well established. There have already been reports of persons crossing over to Thailand already from areas like Karen State, and I think that those channels, those routes, are going to be increasingly used by other groups as well, including just ordinary Myanmar citizens, even those who don't have a particular ethnic minority affiliation. But it's a very scary time in Myanmar right now. There's a lot of instability, a lot of confrontation, and it's really quite terrifying for a lot of ordinary citizens, whether or not they have from a background of persecution in the past. And it's even scarier for those persons who are from conflict zones, which are still trying to seek resolution of armed conflict. And then, of course, for the Rohingya population and the broader Rakhine population, they've just gone through years and years of instability and violence, massive violence. And, none of these issues look like they're going to be resolved anytime soon under this, with this current military in power.
Yeah. Lilianne, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. We really appreciate your time and you sharing your insights about this particular issue. Thank you. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching and good night.
Fokus kita sekarang adalah gelombang ketiga. Elakkan 3S, iaitu kawasan yang sesak, sempit dan juga